Hello, this is a kickoff for the Bible study of Romans that we're beginning this month. And I'm starting with a kickoff here. And then starting next week, you're going to go from chapter to chapter in the book by N.T. Wright, Romans for Everyone. So what I'd like to do is kind of show you the beginning of this and how this goes. And then you're ready to go into the next one. We had a meeting today with some of the folks online, and we had a really great discussion. I kind of like to describe that discussion a little bit as well. So first, I'll share my screen here. And I chose to start with, in the kickoff, to start in Romans chapter 16. And you may wonder, why start at the end? Well, because when you go into Romans, especially in chapter 1, it's heavy. It hits you over the head right away. And I think it's really good to start by discussing who Paul was speaking to and who Paul was ministering with, because that's really a very important part of Romans. Romans is actually a very joyful book when you look at it in whole, and especially what it means for people who are looking for freedom and freedom in the gospel. So I think it's really good to start off with just all the people that Paul really depended on. So I'm not going to read this because there's lots of names involved in it, but these are the people that Paul is asking for the Romans to greet them, and because they played a very important role in Paul's ministry. I'm going to focus on two people because one of the features of this section is the prominence of women. And just like we have in our churches today, women played a very important role in the first century church. You really wouldn't have had the spread of Christianity and the first century church doing what it did without these very important women. And this passage is a clue to that here. And the first person I'll talk about is Phoebe, a deacon. And I'll go to this chart here and you'll see how the role of women has changed in our English translations over the years. And this kind of shows how much we in the American church have actually minimized women, and how much over time, as we've come to honor women in ministry more, that we begin to see the language in a different way. So if you look at Phoebe, for example, in the King James Version, she is described as a servant and a succorer. I think that's how you say that word. And then when you get to the American church, and I started with the Darby translation here, just as an example of a 19th century example, she's described as a minister and a helper. Now that's a little bit better, minister as in a servant, but also somebody who's actively serving, not being forced to serve, but still a helper. Then we get to the 20th century with the American Standard Version, and she's back to being a servant again. Now, and she's a helper. Now, when we get to the Revised Standard Version in the 1950s, the Revised Standard Version was a triumph because it really solved a number of the translation problems that we had in our American translations, and even when you look back to the King James Version. But even with its more enlightened view of the scriptures, it still can't get over the fact that Phoebe was a woman. So they translate her as a deaconess and a helper. Well, by the time we get to the 70s and the NIV, finally, Phoebe is a deacon and she is a benefactor. In the NRSV, which is what we use in worship at our church, she's a deacon and a benefactor. Fantastic. But then This is a translation many of you probably aren't very familiar with, called the English Standard Version, but it's very popular among evangelicals and conservatives in the church today. And guess what? They went backwards. They started calling her a servant again, and they called her something a little bit less important than a benefactor. They called her a patron, just basically somebody who donated. When you look at Greek, diakonon is a masculine noun. And so this idea of using a feminine version of the noun is really just to minimize her, especially when you talk about her being a servant, is just to minimize her role instead of being an officer of the church, which she really was. This other word, prostatus, can be a feminine or a masculine, but it does have a sense of being something that's an important person that is has a financial stake in what's happening. So really, benefactor is a good word. But you can see that our perception of first century women really had not that much to do with Paul, but had more to do with our perception of the words and how it was translated in our own culture and our own patriarchy in America. So I think this is a great passage in order to kind of understand what we have done. I'm going to talk about another person here. Her name is Junia, and it says greet Andronicus and Junia, and because they're paired together, it's quite likely that Junia, who is a female, was probably married to Andronicus. It says, my relatives who were in prison with me. Boy, that's important. The Romans did not send women to prison for just anything, because women were considered part of the household. So women were just said, well, if she's out of line, well, you take care of it. The state's not going to take care of it unless she was a threat. So being a threat to the state probably meant she was imprisoned because she was an important person, because she was preaching the gospel, and that was really a problem for them. The other clue we have here is that they are prominent among the apostles. So here we go, a female apostle, and that there is a strong link there. And when you look at the Greek, that's what it is. However, when you come down here and you look at our translations in English, you can see how this presented a problem and how they tried to minimize Junia. If you look at the King James Version, she is a feminine noun. Okay, that's good, because that's really what Junia is. When you get to Darby and you get to the American translation, she becomes a man, Junius. Well, the funny thing about that is there is no Junius. Junius was not even really a name at the time, but they put a masculine ending on the name in order to solve this problem that they had of thinking of Junia being an apostle. And this persisted into the ASV and NASV. And then even as enlightened as the RSV was, they still kept her as a masculine, still translated her as a man. Finally, the NIV brings her back as a female, which the noun really is, NRSV as well. Now, even the ESV, which is as conservative and sexist as it is, she is a female there. Ionion or Union is her name, and that is a feminine noun. Now, but the problem with the ESV is that they drop that word apostle because they have problems. The very conservative complementarian evangelicals of today still have a problem of thinking of Junia being an apostle. So you can still see that even today, the translations make a difference. One thing I'll say here about Phoebe in particular and why she was so important is she came from Cenchrea, which is about 5 miles from Corinth, right here on this isthmus in Greece. And she traveled all the way to Rome, about 1,000 miles. Now, when you think about that, a woman doing that in the first century, she had to have been a person of means in order to be able to make that trip. We don't know if she made it alone or not, but clearly she was a very important person. We also know that when you delivered a letter, especially a very important letter like the letter to the Romans, the person would go and read that letter in the home churches, mostly because a lot of the people were illiterate, so they needed somebody to do that. But they also needed to have somebody interpret it. One of the folks in our Bible study today in the discussion asked the question, did Phoebe know Latin? And I was kind of blown away by the question. I don't know. Nobody knows, really. But yeah, most of the Romans were speaking Latin at the time. They weren't speaking Greek. Now, a lot of educated Romans probably did know Greek, but what about the slaves and the people, the servants and other people in the churches probably only knew Latin. So we don't know, but clearly Phoebe was an educated person. Clearly she was somebody who was sent because she was trusted, and she went there to interpret for them, and may have had to use translators or interpreters in order to provide it in the language that they were that they were used to in Latin, or maybe Phoebe knew Latin herself. So we'll end by looking at N.T. Wright's questions for this. And one of the important questions is, who was the most influential person in your spiritual journey? I'm betting that most of the time it was both men and women who provided that spiritual guidance for you. I know that's definitely true for me, that women as I was growing up, my mother, but also many other women in terms of leaders and Sunday school teachers and pastors provided significant spiritual growth for me. What do you notice about the house churches in Rome? Well, we just talked about that a little bit. One of the things that came up in the discussion was that the house churches probably were, hosted by people of means, of course, but they were attended by slaves, and certainly were attended by women. So these churches were places of people of different classes coming together, or people of different status in society coming together. Really amazing. Phoebe was the letter bearer, and she was entrusted with the fullest and most remarkable letter of Paul. What have we learned about Phoebe? This is really remarkable, is how much trust Paul put into Phoebe. Clearly, Phoebe was a person of means, a person who could be trusted, a person of discernment. Otherwise, Paul would not have entrusted the letter to her. And then finally, we talked about the holy kiss. And in American society, of course, we don't really kiss each other as a greeting so much. But many parts of the world, especially like in Europe or Africa, for example, people kiss each other a lot. The double kiss in Germany and France is very common, a common way of greeting each other. And certainly that was the case in the first century church as well. But what that really means is you don't kiss, even then, you just didn't kiss anybody. No, you kissed people that you were close to, that you were at least friends with, and maybe family with. So the idea here is that's a community, and there's community building happening here. So with this, I'd like to say this is the kickoff. Next week, we'll begin with the first chapter on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock on Zoom. And then we're going to begin the after church Bible study again, and we'll do them in parallel. So we go through the book together on September 26th. Next week, we're going to be busy with a congregational meeting and a session meeting. So we'll begin that with chapter 2 after church on the 26th. And I really hope that you get to join some of those. The book is really easy to use, and you can miss a couple of weeks even and pick it up. It's that easy to use. But I really hope that you're enriched by this study of Romans. And peace be with you. Enjoy this. Bye.